Welcome back to another episode of the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. Today, Joey and I will be having an affair with Virginia Woolf and her novel, The Waves. This is the first time we have discussed a novel on this podcast, so I'm very excited about that process, Joey. Let's do a quick summary of the story since we have devoted many of our conversations to Virginia Woolf's background. I think it is safe to say that you and I, and hopefully our listeners, are very well aware of who Virginia is and what her place in the literary canon is. So here's the summary of The Waves. The Waves follows six friends: Bernard, Susan, Rhoda, Neville, Ginny, and Lewis, from childhood to old age, tracing their inner lives through poetic soliloquies. Yes, easy for me to say, poetic soliloquies. Structured in 9 sections, each prefaced by a lyrical description of the sea at different times of the day. The novel mirrors the ebb and flow of human experience. The characters' voices intertwine, revealing their distinct personalities. Bernard, the storyteller; Susan, who is so rooted in nature; Rhoda, fragile and alienated; Neville, a perfectionist; Ginny, a socialite; and Lewis, an outsider yearning for acceptance. As they mature, their monologues explore universal themes of identity, time, mortality, and the elusive nature of reality. Their friendships deepen and fracture, marked by shared moments and their private struggles. The seventh character, Percival, an admired but silent figure, dies young, symbolizing the fragility of life. In the final section, Bernard, now elderly, reflects on the passages of time and the merging of individual lives into a collective human wave. Woolf's experimental prose blurs the line between consciousness and the external world, creating a symphony of inner voices. The novel eschews traditional plot for psychological depth, capturing the fluidity of memory and the search for meaning in a transient existence. So, Joey, that was one heck of a summary. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Could you share with me your first impressions of The Waves and what your experience was reading this novel?
Sure. Before I do that, though, I just want to I want to preface this by to explain that we don't want to necessarily go over the entirety of the book because it's not that long. It's like 200, it's less than 300 pages, like 297, my edition. But that's a lot to go. That we would end up just giving chapter summaries, and that's not really any fun. You could just read those online. So I wanted to limit our scope for our analysis to chapters 4, 5, and 9 because I thought those were the most pivotal to the story. And I think really chapters 4 and 5 are probably the most pivotal in my opinion after rereading it, but whatever. Okay, so with that out of the way, this definitely felt like a very stereotypical Virginia Woolf story for me because it was like, it's too big to comprehend, sort of. Like it's very simplistic. It's about 6 characters, technically 7, because Percival, of course, has to be included. But they are it just goes over so much of their life, and even though we're only getting pieces of their life at different milestones, it does feel like how do you sum up an entire person's life, never mind 6 people, with the addition of Percival, whose life ends in his youth. So, and I think that's sort of the summary of the novel that we learn in, or we get to see Bernard or Bernard. Is that how they pronounce it? The British translation or translation? The British way is like Bernard or something. All right, I don't know. I'm not British,
We're going to
but
call him like Saint Bernard. So it's going to be
yeah,
Bernard.
I'm gonna say Bernard, but it's just funny that they pronounce it differently. Anyway, I think in his summation of chapter 9, he kind of he talks about that where he talks about how language kind of fails to sum up someone's life. You can't really talk about someone's life in totality. It's too nuanced, but anyway. So that feels like my exact impressions of this novel. It's sort of a little too hard for me to put it into words. I'm going to, but it was difficult. But yeah, I think that the soliloquies are an interesting choice because we're getting all dialogue, sort of, and inner monologue. And I don't think that other authors could achieve that type of writing other than Virginia Woolf. I don't know that anybody else could do it. A whole almost 300-page novel of stream of consciousness where we're only jumping in between characters' minds and sometimes their conversation. But yeah, Obviously, it's one of her masterpieces. A lot of people say that this is her best work that she ever wrote. I'm holding it right here, The Waves. So yeah, I can see why people think that is this is her best work so far. I think it's really great.
And Joey, thank you for holding up the visual because that reminded me we did not set this in a time and a place. So we believe that this novel was published in 1931, correct? Which was one decade
Mm.
before she tragically lost her life. So, Joey, thank you for that summary. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that reading this novel was a very different experience than our short stories that we have discussed or other bits of her life. I will also say that it's not something, as I tried to do, to sit down and read it in a day. It really, I think, would benefit from a longer time span. As you said, how do you sum up someone's life in a paragraph? That's probably not a very accurate description of how someone has conducted their life. So I agree with you. Also, very Virginia Woolf, very one thing leads to another. And you're like, wait, why are we talking about the bubbles on the stovetop in a pot of water? And now we're talking about a green caterpillar. And like, we're just kind of flitting back and forth. But
Hmm.
in totality, as you had mentioned to me in one of our previous conversations about the novel, as you were so excited to start reading it and were encouraging me to get started, is that the characters, the six main characters that we actually sort of see into their brains, we see their relationships with themselves and with the other friendships. You start to understand who these characters are in a very deep way. And the way that it was written was very interesting because, as you said, sometimes there's a single quote, like one little apostrophe that will get this started. I'm like, okay, is that in your head? Because then sometimes you say things in double quotes, which to me is more appropriate to an actual spoken piece of dialogue. So I found that to be a little bit confusing, but in knowing what we know about Virginia Woolf, it kind of doesn't matter if you said it out loud or if it was in your head because people are incomprehensible. So it does not matter if I tell you straight to your face what I'm thinking. You probably still don't understand what I'm actually thinking in the world of
Hmm.
Virginia Woolf. It's very
Hmm.
difficult. And Joey, for me, some of the large themes were the passage of time and the unreliability of your perspective to look at memory. She did such a great job of showing us scenes from multiple people's point of view, and little details would be carried through each person's narrative, but you're like, wow, that's just such a different perspective. And so for me, it was the power of storytelling because I do a lot of talking about how to craft a good story. What happens when you lose your audience, right? There are things when Bernard's like, oh, I'm doing so great. And then I kind of lost thread of the story and I can tell that nobody's following me. So I have to like figure this out. And I thought that was a very reflective thing of Virginia Woolf's experience, probably of like, how do you hone your craft to make sure that your audience is still engaged with you? The power of
Hmm.
friendship. This to me was also a blueprint for personality types. We had people who were severe introverts, we had people who were extroverts, we had people who thrived in a crowd, people who were like, if I never speak to another human in my whole life, I will be so incredibly happy. I just thought she did such a beautiful job of giving us this spectrum of human experience. And yet, they met as children, I'm going to say 8, 9, 10 years old in school. They share that experience and they follow themselves all the way through the end of their lives. And it was like, well, something was binding them together. It certainly wasn't their matching personalities or their hobbies or their interests because they were all so varied. And yeah, I just love that she said it's love and hate and friendship.
Yeah, it's a mystery to me why they didn't sort of stay connected. But I want to talk about briefly, you were saying with, first of all, I did not notice the quotation marks either being single or double. So good, good eye there because did not notice that. But maybe if I reread it, I am sick of rereading it because I've read it so many times now. I've been like dipping in and out of it for 3 weeks straight. So, and that's the only book I've been reading. So I'm sort of sick of it. I love it, but like I'm like, I just need a break, girl. Okay. I reread it again. Eventually, I will reread it if that is what the signal is to the reader that this is either out loud or in someone's head. So that's interesting. I'm
And it
really
doesn't,
curious.
sorry, Joey, and it does not come out in the audiobook. So both you and I had the experience of reading with our eyes and listening with our ears. So I think that
Yeah.
also was very interesting. And it was a helpful suggestion from you to me to, hey, if you're having a little trouble getting started, listen, and everything will make much more sense.
Yes. So I think that using the audiobook alongside do like a hybrid reading made it really clear because I read it. I think we were just talking about this in our last whatever conversation. We were talking about this at one time in life and our lives here, but I was talking about how the audiobook sort of cleared it up for me without knowing that that could be the signal, that it made it obvious to me that it was either spoken out loud or in their head. And I think as I got to know the characters more, I kind of understood when they were going to have that conversation or when they were alone. Like if you know they're alone, then there's probably they I talk to myself out loud all the time, even though I live alone. So I don't judge them. But okay, so now that our overall feelings are out of the way, we could get into each of the chapters that we wanted to dive into. So for chapter 4, in case anyone has not read it, and if you have read it and are like, how am I supposed to remember what chapter 4 is? This is the scene where they all come together for the dinner to see Percival off because he's going to India. And so Bernard opens, in my head, I say it in like the British way because I've been listening to the audiobook so many times. So Bernard opens this chapter, and Bernard kind of feels like the main character, even though there is not a main character. Maybe I haven't seen anything where people said like Bernard's the main character. I feel like but they don't all get as equal amount of time, especially because Bernard obviously closes the entire book, and chapter 9 is pretty long. I don't know if it's the longest chapter of the book, but it's pretty long. I really love this scene. I like how this is the first time that they're coming together as young adults, or the oldest, I can't remember which one says it, but the one of them says that no one is older than 25 at the dinner. So they're all pretty young. They're in their mid to early 40s, 20s. So they're at this really interesting part of life, which we have both experienced as adults, that you kind of are like, I'm an adult, but like I still know everything. And you still kind of have like that teenage mentality a little bit where you're like, I can't be told about myself. So
And when does life start? I think there's that big
yeah.
apprehension and that anticipation at this scene that you're about to describe that they're like, hey, I just got engaged. Hey, he's just going to India. People are questioning what's the next unfolding of their story.
Yeah, and I think a lot of things stuck out again, too many things probably, but the idea that Percival is following in this sort of imperialist tradition to go to either Africa or India, most of the literature that I have read from England that would be set around this time and earlier, like Jane Austen is much earlier, obviously, but stuff like that, where British men go to these other, well, Africa is a continent, and India is a subcontinent, but foreign lands, typically in Africa or India, to sort of make their fortune and come back and be rich and then like an eligible bachelor and then find marriage or whatever, find someone to marry. So I thought it was interesting that there are little aspects of racism throughout. I don't think that this is a racist novel. Like that the point is not racism. She's not commenting on racism, but I wonder if that was her point, was to highlight or illuminate this tradition of British men going to these British colonies in Africa and India, because there are some blatantly racist descriptions in the story, and I'll just read one of them. There's no like racial slurs necessarily. Okay, but I'll just read it. I'll just read it. You get what I'm saying. But now I swear, making deliberately in front of the glass those slight preparations that equip me, I will not be afraid. Think of the superb omnibuses, red and yellow, stopping and starting, punctually in order. Think of the powerful and beautiful cars that now slow to a foot's pace and now shoot forward. Think of men, think of women, equipped, prepared, driving onward. This is the triumphant procession. This is the army of victory with banners and brass eagles and heads crowned with laurel leaves won in battles. They are better than savages in loincloths and women whose hair is dank, whose long breasts sag with children tugging at their long breasts. Those broad thoroughfares, Piccadilly South, Piccadilly North, Regent Street, and the Haymarket, are sanded paths of victory driven through the jungle. The reason why I added all that extra part is because there is this comparison of sort of the modern civilized world of England in juxtaposition with, I'm assuming, something like India, because this is from Bernard's perspective, and obviously he's going to meet with Percival and all his friends. So I thought that was interesting. And there are some other, I think there's only a handful of references to savages and things like that. But I just thought it was an interesting aspect because if you think about something like Jane Austen, which again, a lot earlier, that there's a mention that people will be doing this, but there's no other information. And I don't think that there's any mention of something like this that's that descriptive.
Joey, I appreciate that because I thought you were going to take us to the scene where Percival dies and they talk about him being bandaged by dark-skinned people in India, being fanned by, they called them the coolies. I don't know if that is a racially insensitive term or not. I am reading that directly from the text. And they were fanning them. And in
Hmm.
the description of that, they said, I don't remember. And literally, this is kind of what it says in this is what it says in the text. I don't remember what those fans are called. So there was very specific othering in this particular novel in that portion, but I think it was true to the time and place.
Hmm.
And what really struck me when you were talking about colonialism and a rite of passage, and this is just with men of a certain class in England. I don't think your everyday Joe got to go on these adventures to these
Hmm.
foreign lands. I don't know that for certain, but I didn't get that impression that maybe his death unexpectedly at 25, falling from a horse, just living his life in India, going on this mission, the senselessness of that. Had he stayed home, had someone, it's written in the text, had someone said, wait a minute, let me pull the horse's cinch on the saddle, three more belt loops, three more pegs, he'd still be alive. And so it was the senselessness of the mission to go there, I think was hinted at, and also the careless randomness. And there's a whole beautiful passage that refers to fate as like a drunken man with a club. You do not know who is going to be struck next. And I thought that again was a very interesting way to say, was it his fate? Was this just purely a curious accident? I just thought she did such a great job, she being Virginia Woolf, through the
Hmm.
voice of Bernard, who gave us so many beautiful scenes. I think, as you said, is that the main character? I'm like, well, he certainly did the most talking and the most descripting. Others had little vignettes, but I think he's like, I am a storyteller. I write things down. It is my curse to tell you these stories. And I thought that was also super interesting because as we have looked at Virginia Woolf and her circle of friends and the Bloomsbury group and her relationship with her husband and her sister and those in her social circle, it was hard for me to divorce that from my watching these characters love, hate, grow together, have envy, have insecurities, have the respect for each person's personality type, but also like, come on, like go with the flow. We're all trying to do this together. Why are you being so standoffish? It's like, that's my brand. I like being standoffish. Why are you being so pushy? So yeah, I really just thought that was so beautiful and hard for me to pull apart who might be the Virginia Woolf character. And I think there was a bit of her, based on what we've known about her past, in every single one of those characters. I could make a case for that.
I want to go back to what you were saying about this rite of passage for, well, well, just for Percival at this point, but because in this scene, we also learn that Bernard is engaged to be
Yes.
married, which you did mention. So that to me, this is why I really liked this scene, is because I think this is when they start to contemplate their own mortality as young adults. And they see that this is fleeting. Youth is fleeting. I do not get to be this carefree person forever. I have to make a decision, whatever that decision may be. And I can't really go back. And there's a lot of, there's like so much beautiful language in in the whole book about every topic and every theme. So it's hard to pick just one thing. But I think the moment is when Susan talks about it in this scene, when she is describing what this means for everyone, but especially for her, I guess, when they find out that Bernard is engaged. So she said, "How strange," said Susan, "the little heaps of sugar by the side of our plates. Also the malted peelings of pears and the plush rims to the looking glasses. I had not seen them before. Everything is now set. Everything is fixed. Bernard is engaged. Something irrevocable has happened. A circle has been cast on the waters. A chain is imposed. We shall never flow freely again." And then there's a little bit more description after that, but I'll end it there because I could go on and read the entire chapter and it'd be like, oh, isn't this all beautiful? But I think this is the exact moment, or at least it was for me, when they all realized, like, oh, Bernard did the adult thing. He's the first one to be like a real adult. Percival has yet to go to India. He has yet to take part in that tradition. This is sort of like the fantasy part of this tradition where we're just it's anticipatory. But Bernard is like actively engaging, literally, with adulthood, and they realize like they are kind of like taking stock of each other, like you said in the beginning, where they're seeing like, how have we changed since we were children? Why aren't we really that close anymore? And their personalities start to come out, which I'll stop here, but I do want to read the one part where Bernard describes each of them very quickly when you're done with whatever you want to
No,
say.
Joey, I would love it if you do that, because what it felt like for me before you say that is it felt like they were coming back. In America, we do high school reunions. So like they were coming back
Yeah.
to their 5 or 10 year high school reunion and they're like, "Hey, so how are things going?" And they were giving each other an update.
Mhm.
And I would love to have you read that passage where Bernard goes
All right, one.
and talks through each of the points. I think that was very poignant and very telling.
Yeah. So he's specifically said to be the phrase maker. So I think that's why he is basically our narrator to some extent, because obviously he's not. But okay, anyway, he says, "I see Lewis, stone carved, sculpturesque, Neville, scissor cutting, exact, Susan with eyes like lumps of crystal, Ginny dancing like a flame, febrile, hot over dry earth, and Rhoda, the nymph of the fountain, always wet. These are fantastic pictures. These are figments, these visions of friends in absence, grotesque, dropsical, vanishing at the first touch of the toe of a real boot." So I really loved that. First of all, he can't describe himself, and I think that's part of Bernard's problem with himself, is that he can see things so clearly in other people and he can assign language to it every time. He is very articulate, but he has a really hard time doing it to himself. And I think at the end is when that becomes most apparent, is that he sort of oh, anyway, let's not jump the gun. It gives you such a an interesting glimpse into each of these characters, even if it's not the correct characterization that these characters would assign for themselves. It's interesting to see them through Bernard's lens.
And Joey, that's not where I thought you were going. So thank you for taking us there. But where I thought you were going is the scene that is being described as each of them enter the meeting room. They are all like at in this banquet space, and they're walking
Hmm.
into this restaurant. So we see Neville, who is in love with Percival, says,
Hmm.
he's sitting there 10 minutes early. Every time the door opens, he's like, "Oh, it's not him. Oh, oh darn, still not him." And he does
Yeah.
this over and over again. And he said, there's a morbidity. He said the word, it was morbid or morbidity to this glancing up and seeing it is not Percival, and how his heart leapt when Percival finally got there. And they describe Rhoda coming in and like try to circumvent the whole crowd. She looks like a scared animal. She's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I'm here." And she sits down. Ginny comes in and the room stops. Everyone looks at her. She is just this mesmerizing physical person who just exudes this charisma that she's like, "Hey, I just showed up. I'm not doing anything here. I'm being myself." And they said Susan had more like an animal instinct. She just honed right in on where she was going. She bumped into waiters, other patrons, did not matter. She's like, "I am coming to roost with my people." And I just thought that was such an interesting way to express what we know about these characters based on what we've heard about the previous experiences they've had together, of distilling their sort of worldview and how they inhabited that space. I know. And then Percival does show up, and everyone's like a big sigh of relief. Like they are just so
Hmm.
happy that he was there. And they do describe Lewis, in my mind, always kind of got overlooked, and that was part of his otherness. He had an Australian accent. His father was a failed banker in Brisbane, which comes up multiple, multiple times.
Hmm.
Apparently, there was some kind of shame or some kind of class differentiation there. Not my culture, don't understand it, but it was evident in this novel that he said, he walked in and there was a mirror, a looking glass, and he's like fixing his hair. He's like, okay, okay, well, I'm not even going to bother because I don't fit in with you guys. And it doesn't matter if my hair's a mess or not because you're still judging me. So I'm just going to walk in and sit down and take my place at this table. And I just thought it was just so fascinating to have the descriptions of each of these characters mimic what I thought I knew about the characters at 25. And they go around the table and they're all being like little kids again as they were. They're describing scenes and they're using all of these interesting little vignettes that we can bounce back in their history to understand. It literally felt like to me a high school room. It was like, hey, remember the time we set the science room on fire? Like it was that kind of energy that they were just trading memories from their childhood. And since earlier in the novel, we were shown from almost each one of those perspectives, except Percival doesn't really, we don't know much about his experience other than how adored he is. We can recount what they say now. Does that match what we thought they were thinking then when we were hearing those scenes being explained in the narrator's view?
Yeah, it's interesting that we get so many different perspectives of each of these characters' personalities. As you were just talking about, that's a good point, is to talk about how they enter the room, because that really tells us a lot more by their actions and not by Bernard's descriptions of them. But we can compare those things then and see like how accurate is Bernard's view of them. And Neville scissor cutting, I guess, is I think these are pretty close, I would say, in my opinion, to their actual personalities. A little bit more poetic, obviously. Lumps of eyes with lumps of crystals for Susan, who I like and I really want. I feel like she's the woman in the looking glass because she's like all natures and stuff. She loves nature and stuff. But yeah, I think it was a good chapter for us to learn all about all of these characters as adults instead of just seeing them as children, and obviously then in high school when the they're separated by gender because of their schooling. And I think it was so interesting because I could not figure out why is Percival so why is he held in such high regard? Like Percival was a pretty average student to my recollection in the book. He was sort of just like middle of the road, nothing quite that special about. He didn't seem to excel necessarily at anything in particular. And if he did, I don't remember apparently, but I just couldn't figure out like, well, why is Percival the one that they all adore? Because it seems like they would have never have come back together had it not been for Percival. Percival is the mutual friend, is the uniting factor for them. And it's so odd that Virginia Woolf doesn't even give us his perspective. We don't hear from him at all. He's just in the room, but he's silent. I mean, if he's talking, we obviously just don't hear it. But I just thought, like, what is the point of Percival? I think he acts as sort of like maybe like Byronic hero or something like that, and everyone sort of envies and looks up to him and for whatever reason. But yeah, I thought it was just such an odd way of doing it, of just creating this whole character. And we've read lots of stories like that where we have to learn about characters in the blank spaces and fill in everything else, and we only learn them through secondary sources, basically through other perspectives. So in I mean, again, like that's hard to achieve in writing. I've never tried to do it, but in other cases, it's a hard thing to do to have a character that's so believable. Like I believe Percival is a real person. So it's just great job, Virginia Woolf.
Yeah, great job. And Joey, I had a very interesting experience with Percival in my imagination because one of the things that made him so beloved is that he was able to, they said men would follow him, children would follow him. He just had this natural leadership charisma, that there was this
Mm,
potential in him, but he didn't seem to really care too much about who liked him, who didn't like him. He was marching to his own drummer in a way that other people liked, but it
mhm.
was not these characters that we have heard of, Ginny and Susan and Neville and Bernard, like we hear a lot about them, inner voices, their insecurities, their desire for social position or to be overlooked. Like there's a lot of that inner conflict with them. And because we hear none of that about Percival, he comes across as a confident, normal guy going about his life. People like him, they enjoy his company, they seek him out. He doesn't really care. Like he's just doing his thing. He loves going to sporting matches. He loves doing those kind of things because Neville said, I only care about sporting matches because he does. And he loves
Hmm.
that about me, but I can't get excited about sports if Percival is not involved in them. And she also makes a reference to, and you're going to have to help me out with this, Ajax, Hercules,
Hmm.
all of those Greek guys that we have talked about from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And there was a very specific homosexual love stories with Achilles. And I was very curious because they said many, many times Neville loved Percival and that love was not returned. I did not take that as a homosexual love. I have female friends that I can say I love, I admire, I adore who they are and how they take up space in the world. So I didn't want to paint him with that brush, but I just thought it was interesting because one of the things you and I had talked about previously offline was the mention of Lucretius's poem. She talks about Lucretius 3 times. She talks about Catullus. She
Yeah.
talks about him 6 times. That's the one joy I will say about having an electronic copy of the book. You can key on some key phrases and see how many times they're referenced. But I just thought
Mm.
that was very interesting that they kept going back that Lewis, who was disadvantaged because he was othered by being an outsider from Australia and having an accent and not really being able to blend, they're like, he was the smartest kid in our school. And unfortunately, because his dad didn't have status and they didn't have other opportunities, he didn't get to go on and further his education. He had to go work as a clerk in an office somewhere. And they're like, his beautiful potential was squashed. He's like, I know I'm the smartest one here. I am talking to, he would say, I am, the contemporary in his mind. He's like, I am timeless. I've been out through the ages. I can talk to Aristotle. I can talk to Plato. I'm with Shakespeare. I am doing all of the things. And I think in some ways he did. He was just really a genius. And I think maybe in addition to Percival's life being snuffed out because of this accident through imperialism and colonialism and what he needed to do for his military service, I think there's a very big underscore exclamation point of a life that was wasted because society said, we don't have a spot for you. Sorry, Lewis. I know you're like really bright and everything, but you don't have the pedigree to advance here. And I think that was really tragic. And I believe that that has changed in our modern society, but that just felt curious that so many times they referred to him in that way. And he's like, I am a timeless human being. I have been here, I've walked the sands next to the Nile. I have done all of these experiences because his creativity, his intellect, his curiosity, he did have all those lives. Literally. Like what do we do when we read? We've had all these lives too, Joey. Like we've
Hmm.
we've walked those paths.
Yeah, I do love that passage of, I mean, I could say that about the whole
We
book.
highlighted half the
From
book, Joey.
yeah,
If you're
from
like me, I
start
was
to
just like,
finish. Yeah. I didn't want to highlight in my actual book, so I was just like typing out the quotes because I was like, I don't want to when I go to reread it one day, I don't want to like mess up my reading and be like, "Oh, I really cared about this part. I wanted to like clean slate." But anyway,
okay,
um
a little asterisk. Sorry, Joey. In my electronic copy of the book.
oh
So
yeah,
yes,
okay.
I
I
did
also
not
have an ebook
deface
version.
a physical copy. I did not.
No, I do that sometimes, but in this, I don't know. I just was like, I have to keep it a secret, apparently. But yes, the way that Lewis describes his worldliness, he's a Renaissance man, that I really love that, where I think that is such a good point that that is the benefit of reading and being I wouldn't necessarily say creative. I don't because he was doing finance. That's not to say you can't do that creatively. You could you could
Legally,
do
can you do
yeah,
creative
you could do that.
financing?
But yeah, I think he was just interested in so much. He was interested in the classics like antiquity with Catullus and all, he was referring to Homer. Go ahead.
Joey, just one thing, but he wasn't boasting. He
Hmm.
never said this in a way that was arrogant or condescending. He's like, these are facts. I know things most of you people don't care about. And I thought that was really beautiful because many of his commentary points were watching the other boys who were boasting. And he used that phrase. He's like, the boys who boast, they're always the same. And he was like, that's not me. I am just telling you how it is. So, Joey, please
Hmm.
continue. But I just thought that was a really important point. We're extolling him with all these virtues, but I don't think he was arrogant or condescending or had an overinflated sense of himself. He was like, this is just me. I was born this way. I just showed up like this.
Yeah, I woke up like this. That's Beyonce. All right. I think he was not boastful. He wasn't trying to be like bragging and say like, "Hey, I guess what? I'm smarter than all of you. You guys are all dummies." But I think maybe Bernard would get that. But even though I don't think he was being boastful either, but maybe because he talked the most about himself. But definitely Lewis, like in the dinner scene, Lewis says like, I fixed my hair, but I didn't even want to. I only did it because like you guys did it and I just want to fit in. And you're like, oh, like you said the quiet part out loud. And again, I mean, and maybe he doesn't say that out loud. And maybe that was just my assumption was that he was sort of confronting his friends about that. But anyway, we have almost spent this whole time only talking about one chapter. Again, we could seriously do an episode for every single chapter. We just 9 episodes.
And Joey, a separate bonus episode just about the way in which she wrote it with those descriptive language and the color
Yeah.
and the repetition and the sun. Yeah.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode about the waves, like the interludes. That would be interesting. Anyway, let's see how far we get with this. Okay. In chapter 5 is when Percival dies. We begin the chapter with learning that Percival is gone. I don't think they say he's dead. I think they just say he's gone. And that is I think is a pivotal moment for the six remaining characters, because now they have to face the death of their beloved friend, beloved Percival. And I have a feeling that this is probably the first time that any of them has experienced a death in that's like close to them of some type of relation. So this feels like it hits all of them hard. But oddly enough, only Neville, Bernard, and Rhoda speak in this chapter. Susan, Ginny, and Lewis, can't keep all of them together, don't actually tell us anything. We get their perspectives. We get to know how they're feeling through the other characters, but they are not given time to speak about it. And so Neville opens this chapter, which I think everything that Virginia Woolf does is incredibly intentional, and that's why it's hard to read her work because everything has to be put under a magnifying glass. And so you have to pick your battles. But I think to your point, Jennifer, you're saying that Neville is in love with Percival in a homosexual way, which I completely agree. And I see everything as gay. So that's not hard for me to say. But yes, I think he is the most distraught by Percival's death because there was this romantic element. And whether it was reciprocated or not, it was something that Neville certainly had feelings for. So I think that he is extremely upset by it. I think what was such a beautiful way, and I believe it ends this chapter, is that Rhoda makes a sort of a sacrifice to the gods. I mean, there's a lot of myth, Greek, not necessarily Greek myth, but there's a lot of Greek inspiration. You're talking about Catullus and all these other people and Aristotle and all of them. And in my opinion or in my interpretation, Rhoda was sort of making sacrifices to the memory of Percival with violets. But I just thought, like, first of all, that's a very sort of Greek polytheistic thing to do, is to make sacrifices. Obviously, it's not cattle or, you're not slaughtering an animal, but she is using violets. So I loved this whole book, but this was a great moment.
Yeah, and Joey, they received this information by telegram that he
Mhm.
was gone. And it was just the poignancy of one person saying, I wish I could just crumple up this telegram and throw it on the ground, and then that wouldn't be true. I wish I didn't have this knowledge. And I thought that was also interesting for us with our instant availability of information, that you're just, you get a knock on the door and some person hands you in your hand a piece of paper that tells you that one of your beloved friends is gone, and how poignant that was, and how they each took that information and reflected upon it. And Bernard, who is very hard on himself, I will say he's very critical of himself. He was like, I don't know who I want to talk to about this. I don't want to talk to Neville because like he's in love with Percival, so that's going to be complicated. And I don't necessarily want to talk to Susan about it because Percival loves Susan. I'm going to go talk to Ginny. So he goes and talks to Ginny and says he invited me to go to Hampton Court and I didn't go. And I feel
Mhm.
really guilty about that. So he's like flogging himself for something he didn't do. And then he sort of snaps out and was like, wait a minute, that happened. Percival wouldn't want me to be upset about this. He's gone. And the poignancy of after they all learn that their friend is gone, I think each one of them in their own way says, I have a responsibility to really live life, to experience this. And I believe Bernard says, today is the first day that I will live that my friend will not. And here are the things I'm noticing. And Joey, I think you and I both have our own experiences of grief with friends and with family members who have passed. I
Mhm.
remember that feeling so distinctly of like, oh, wait, I am here and my friend is not. She is never going to see or experience or hear anything that's happening to me from this point forward. And I think they did a really good job of reminding us of sort of the inherent duty of the living. If they are honoring the dead, they are re-embracing that childhood enthusiasm for noticing all the details. And even though Bernard was the person who wrote everything down, Lewis also could weave a little story. Like he used very simple words in his storytelling. But what Virginia Woolf did for us with these six characters, we don't know anything about Percival really, about his inner monologue. They were so attentive to different parts of their experience. Some person was really, some of the people were very into physical experience. Some were looking at colors. Some were looking at emotional dynamics between people and really understanding that really well. But it was this vividness of their interior monologues that I think carried the whole book through from start to finish.
Yeah, this is a very sobering moment for them because it really gave them that motivation to see things a little bit differently and to age up. I don't know how much time takes place between Percival going to India and falling off the horse and dying. I don't remember them saying anything about a timeline in
Mm.
between. So it was my impression that it happened very quickly, like he went and it happened like in the beginning of his journey there or in the beginning of his stay in India. So whether or not that's true, I don't know, but that was my impression. And so I think again, they have to contemplate their own mortality and say like this man, Percival, that we put on this pedestal that we think is like the most idealized version of a person that you can be. Like we all aspire to be Percival in some aspect, that he can be killed in such a sort of, I don't want to say silly because obviously it's not a silly situation, but in such a careless way that it could have been avoided had there been stricter, there have been some oversight in how his horse was saddled or whatever. Like you were saying, like if they were, if it was like three, whatever, I don't know how
Three
horses.
notches on the
Yes, there
harness,
you
right?
go.
It's like, oh, that
Yeah.
makes sense to me.
I
Just
know
tighten that up.
you measure horses in hands. That's all I know about a horse. Yeah, so like this could have been an avoided situation. He didn't have to die this way. It's not like he died from disease or obviously he wasn't going to die from old age because he's still young at this point, or he wasn't murdered or anything. It was just an accident. So again, I think this underscores that they have to grow up at this moment. And I wonder why Virginia Woolf didn't give us all of their perspectives. We're getting all of their perspectives other than chapter 9. I can't think of another chapter that it's limited to only a few of them. I didn't go and count them all as I was reading because as I was reading it for the first time, I didn't think about that. But this is the only one that it sticks out to me that not all of them have their perspective.
And Joey, I agree with you. I did not take note of that. That was a detail that didn't stick in my mind. But she did in the previous, what we're calling chapters. And in my
Hmm.
electronic book, it did not give them chapters. I was pulling that off of the audiobook version. So that was just
Hmm.
an oddity of my reading experience. It seemed like the voices were, even if they weren't as exhaustive as we would hear from Bernard, we did get snippets of each of the characters in almost all the sections. So that felt very true to life and very balanced. And I think part of it was also some of the characters said, especially Bernard, I come alive in the presence of others. I don't know who I am. This is Bernard speaking. I do
Hmm.
not know. Bernard does not know who he is if there is not an audience. And he said, I am the person who gives everyone words. I am the person who brings difficult situations into a manageable space because I have the words. You may go off in your career and do great things, but sitting at this table in this moment, I am the person who is wielding the power. I am the glue that is conversationally making this happen. And I thought that was really, really quite interesting. Can I read to you, Joey, one of
Yes.
mine that says this? So this is Bernard speaking. The truth is that I need the stimulus of other people. Alone, over my dead fire, I tend to see the thin places in my own stories. The real novelist, the perfectly simple human being, could go on indefinitely, imagining. He would not integrate as I do. He would not have this devastating sense of gray ashes in a burnt out grate. Some blind flaps in my eyes. Everything becomes impervious. I cease to invent. So for him, if the imagination isn't flowing because he is on stage, he is in the audience, he is creating these verbal stories for people,
Hmm.
he feels I don't exist. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it seems like Bernard has this struggle to define himself, which is so ironic because can so easily define his friends, as we were just talking about. And I think that's something that he struggles and really wants to have for himself is a definition to say, this is who I am as Bernard, this is what makes me me. And I think in the end, he sort of matures, even though by this time he's an older man. I don't know how old they are at this point. I don't remember there being a mention of old. He says he's gray and that he's gained weight. So, however old you want to imagine him, I guess, just imagine him. But I think that's when he realizes, like I said in the very beginning of this episode, that you can't really use words to completely define someone's being, that you just kind of have to experience them for who they are, and you shouldn't be as concerned with trying to fit them into a characterization. You should just, just enjoy the moment. And I think he sort of a little jealous that he can't be defined so easily like his friends. Because he calls Lewis and Rhoda the authentics who exist more completely in solitude. They resent illumination, reduplication. They toss their pictures once painted face downward on the field. So, and to your point, you were saying like he needs witnesses to enjoy the moment with him with his words, which reminds me of the Switchman, which it could be in the past or the future that so it's came out or it's coming out. Can't remember. Can't remember. Okay, whoever's
The
listening right now will
elusive
know.
nature, yes, the elusive nature of
Yeah.
time, Joey.
Yes, where we were talking about the Heisenberg theory principle, sorry, the Heisenberg principle in physics, when you observe something, it changes it. And so that's what I was getting from Bernard, where he needs that experience of people witnessing it with him for it to change into a significant experience for him, as if words have really no meaning. And there's some really beautiful language about how the sort of the elusiveness of words and how they almost sort of like have an expiration date. Like the I should have pulled that quote, but again, I was like, how many quotes can I pull here? So my interpretation of it was that doesn't really hold up forever, like your characterization or if your description of something, things change. There's an impermanence to everything, so it can't be the same thing every time. If you say this blanket is blue, eventually it's going to fade. So,
And Joey, I took that in a different direction that you cannot nail someone down with words because the people themselves are evolving, they are changing. There are slight variations of them that no longer ring true. And I'm so glad you brought up the Heisenberg principle because several times throughout this novel, they cite characters, and one of them was one of their school teachers that the act of observing, the act of observing someone and something changes it. So that is like verbatim of what we were talking about in the Switchman of,
Hmm.
wait, how do you even know the impact of the change of being observed when you're not observed? And that just was, again, one of those interesting paradoxes that came out woven throughout almost every section of this, because we are seeing people from the outside and how they're being observed. And then we're getting a glimpse of their internal workings of their mind in those similar circumstances. And it's like, isn't that interesting?
I did find one of the quotes that I was like, oh, I love this idea about language because that's something that you and I always talk about. It's something that just interests us. It's just language in general. Okay, anyway.
We are in love with language. Let's just
Yeah.
own up to it, Joey.
So Bernard, I believe this is from Bernard's perspective, but they say, "Who is to say what meaning there is in anything? Who is to foretell the flight of a word? It is a balloon that sails over treetops. To speak of knowledge is futile. All our experiments and adventures, we are forever mixing ourselves with unknown quantities. What is to come, I know not." I just really loved that idea that we sort of how we talk about authors' works, where it sort of severs from the author and just goes out into the world, and now we can interpret it however we want. We don't care what they have to say about it anymore. And that's what he was trying to say with words, is that it severs from the speaker and just takes on new meaning and new life, and then it eventually could expand to so much, it could expand so big that it eventually sort of dissolves or bursts or whatever, however, whatever metaphor you want to use for language there. But yeah, there's a lot of those. Again, just it's no surprise that Virginia Woolf has beautiful ways of explaining things.
And Joey, I was going to borrow your phrase. Just go read it. Like, we can't
Yeah.
do justice to this story and the multiple stories within the story, right? Each person has their own life story. The beautiful intricacies and realisms of long-term friendships and how those can be so rewarding and so important, but also mysterious and filled with love, hate, envy, greed, jealousy, all those things were described by these young people as they were moving throughout their lives. And their understanding of that, I think, also increased. And Joey, I know we're at the end of our time here, but I just wanted to put one more plug in for this beautiful, beautiful novel of Virginia Woolf. Her language is exquisite. You hear the birds chirping, you see the colors, you hear the waves laughing against the shore, and how that's actually each one of these characters are like a wave. They're sort of, their personalities are incorporated into that wave metaphor. There's just so, so much. We just barely scratched the surface, but hopefully this will entice people to go out and either listen to the audiobook, which the version we will put in the show notes was exquisitely done, so well done.
Hmm.
And the novel itself is definitely easy to understand. Most of the language is very straightforward, but at times she will throw in words that, yes, you will have to look them up in the dictionary because they are so
Yeah.
obscure, precise, poetic, and beautiful. I'm like, wow, like that was the word we needed. Thank you, Virginia, for opening my eyes to a word I probably would not have put in that sentence all by myself.
To close this out, because I'm not surprised that we could talk for such a long time about such a small part of the book. I mean, not that we talked about like a big part of the book. Like this is an important part, but I mean, we can't talk about everything. That's why I was like, we have to sharpen our scope here because there's no way we could get to everything. We could have a month, like months, talking about this story, and people. There are Woolf scholars who devote their lives to reading Virginia Woolf's book. But anyway, if you were gonna rank all of the books that you've read by Virginia Woolf now, what would your order be?
Interesting. So Mrs. Dalloway was my first love, so I have to say yes,
Okay.
tied with To the Lighthouse. And
Okay, so you have
unlike
two number
you,
ones.
Joey, I have not
Mhm.
read all of her work. So now I'm just like, the gauntlet has been thrown down. I need to up my game.
So
That I will then put The Waves as my third. Oh, I cannot. I can't. Because then I was like, well, where does
it
Orlando
it's
go in there? And it was like, that is so
they're all
hard.
number one.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's like a four-way tie for number one, which I know you never
No.
let me have that as the answer. But Joey, what I thought you were going to ask, and I was like, I'm going to ask Joey this question. If you could put yourself into this story, do you identify with one of the 6+1 characters? Is there one character that you're like,
Hmm.
oh, I get you?
even before I knew Neville was gay, I was like, I love Neville. I want this is the character that I most identify with. And it's not a coincidence. He's definitely gay. I will take no notes on that, as I often say when I think that someone's gay in a story. Just let me have it. In this case, we both think he's gay, but
No, Joey, I took it back. I said he was gay. I don't think he pursued a relationship. I think he said, "Oh, this is my truth, but I'm not in a
Mhm.
place where that's going to be expressed. So I'm going to not be
No, yeah,
anything."
I don't think that Neville was actively trying to seek out a relationship as a romantic relationship with Percival, but definitely he was in love with Percival, and I mean, that was we both were like,
We
yeah,
both agree.
yeah, yeah. I don't think that he was trying to. I think he was aware that this was never going to be a reciprocated love. But anyway, that is the character that I would say. How about you?
So I could identify some of my early life experiences with Ginny and also with Ginny's relationship with Rhoda and with Susan, with
Mm,
my friends in my early 20s. So it was just a very interesting of the rivalry, the appreciation of everyone's strengths of walking into a room and having people stop and look. And that was a thing that as an old woman I miss having happen, but maybe it will happen again. Ginny comes to a reckoning in the story. So here's spoiler alert. She has a reckoning where she's like, I don't even look again, the whole looking glass thing. She's like, I don't even look in mirrors without preparing myself that there's going to be a different lady looking back at me than I think I'm going to see. And there's just like a really cute moment in the story where she's like, okay, I just saw myself. I did not prepare myself, but I am okay with this. And then she was like, when she goes out into the street, she said, people still do take notice of me. And I thought that was just a very interesting thing for her to acknowledge. It's different than when she was younger, but she still has whatever that natural charisma was visible to the outside world. I thought that
mm,
was very interesting. And who I wished I was her aspect of her personality where she was so into her body, her physicality. She dances around, she pirouettes, she does all of this. And Susan being the earth mother, hippie farm girl walking in the grass,
yeah,
like
she's a
that's who I
proto
want.
hippie.
That's
Yeah,
that's what I want. So yeah, so Joey, there was quite a an amalgamation of those characters. I am very happy to not be Rhoda because Rhoda
tragic
was
ending.
having some tough times. Yes, we didn't even say that. Not the only person in their friend group who dies. And interesting,
Yeah,
Virginia Woolf writing a suicide right into this narrative.
yeah. Oh, that was what I was gonna say before. Is that it's interesting that I don't know how Virginia Woolf's friends found out about her death. I imagine it's probably through Telegram or I guess maybe a phone call, phone for a thing.
Well, it said
But
Leonard said that he sent out 7 letters to her 7 closest friends before it was broadcast on the BBC and in the Times.
okay,
And
so that's
but
interesting.
but maybe there was also like, well, what about her sister? What about, her nieces and nephews? Like, I don't know how that was spread.
Yeah, but well, her friends, you're saying. Yeah, that's interesting that she kind of told the future a little bit that friends found out through Telegram/letters.
And she could have had that experience learning about people in her social circle. We don't know
Hmm.
about what her experience in that way was. So maybe she did
Yeah,
receive a telegram or saw people in her social circle. It's like, I just got this tragic telegram to let you know that someone important to me is gone. And what do you do with that information once it's in your hand?
yeah. That reminds me of Funny Girl with Barbara Streisand. Have you ever seen it?
I have not. Tell me, Joey.
Oh my God. Okay, I'm not going to tell you the whole thing about Funny Girl because it's not relevant. But there is this moment where a telegram comes and everyone's like, "Oh my God, who died?" It's like a phone call in the middle of the night or something, or like
There's
when
nothing
someone,
good is going to
yeah,
happen.
like someone that only texts you, calls you, and you're like, "Oh my God, who died?" So it just made me think of that, which is very funny. Death is not funny, but that
Very
was funny.
relatable, Joey. There are people that I call.
Yeah,
I'm like, "Hi, it's Jennifer." Yeah,
nothing's
nobody's
wrong.
dead. Just letting you know. I'm just calling for a social call. And they're like, "No, really, why are you calling? Because you don't use the phone." Okay, Joey, we are out of time. And just one last moment about this beautiful novel that we have spent an hour discussing.
Mhm.
It talks a lot about time and about having a storehouse of time that you can use. Some of the characters can't wait to race through their life and they're like, oh, how much longer do I have to be awake and deal with other people? And the other person said, Jenny's like, I can't wait for the morning. Like, I wake up at 5 a.m. just waiting for the day to start. Like, I have this, she said, I had a horde of days ahead of me and I can't wait to see how I will use them. So that was also just a beautiful ending of there's a lot about time and our interpretation of how that's either a burden or the greatest joy. And I really appreciated Virginia Woolf asking us to think about that, especially since she wrote the book Mrs. Dalloway, which is all about the passing of time.
Next week, we'll be reading The Switchman, which I did reference, by Juan Jose Ariola.
Excellent, Joey. Looking forward to that conversation. We'll see you then.